what a lot of court rulings are doing all at once is they're saying this. The president is too powerful. The president has been making law. The president has been interpreting law. That's not the core function of the executive. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start to put the executive back in his box.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm associate producer Leslie Thompson. Clarissa Mole is out this week. In this episode, Russell Moore and Mike Cosper welcome legal expert and New York Times columnist David French to discuss the decisions delivered by the Supreme Court, including an immediate take on the controversial immunity ruling discussed right after the announcement Monday morning. Then we welcome Shane Claiborne to the show. Shane talks with Mike Cosper about the Israel and Hamas conflict and how we might have the posture of Christ amid complex and difficult subject matter. Welcome to The Bulletin.
It's July 1st. As we're sitting down to record right now, it's the end of the Supreme Court term, meaning the High Court is issuing rulings on all the cases it heard throughout this year. So far, there's only one ruling that hasn't been issued. We're literally expecting that any minute as we sit here for this conversation, a ruling on whether or not former President Donald Trump is immune from prosecution for his actions in 2020 and 2021 related to false claims of election fraud. Nonetheless, quite a few other substantial rulings have been released. Here to join us to talk about a few of them and whatever else might come up is David French. David's a columnist for the New York Times who worked as a constitutional lawyer for many years and is someone we turn to regularly here at the Bulletin. David, welcome back.
Well, thanks for having me. I always enjoy it.
Let's start with a ruling that came last week, a ruling in favor of a Pennsylvania police officer named Joseph Fisher. Tell us a little bit about this case and what some of the implications for it are.
Yeah, this case is interesting because this is dealing with a statute that has been used to prosecute a number of the January 6th rioters. And this is dealing with a statute that makes it a crime for anyone to, quote, corruptly alter, destroy, mutilate, or conceal a record, document, or other object with the intent to impair the document's integrity or in availability for use in an official proceeding. So that would seem to say that this statute is talking about documents. But then the very next section says it also means and applies to anyone who, quote, otherwise obstructs, influences, or impedes any official proceeding and attempts to do so. And this was a case that's one of these really archaic statutory interpretation cases. So how do you interpret a statute when you have a very specific provision first, which is here dealing with documents, and then you follow that with a broader, what seems like a catch-all provision? Does it mean that the catch-all provision is the main provision, the one who otherwise obstructs, influences, or impedes any official proceeding, which would clearly cover the conduct of people who entered the Capitol on January 6th, regardless of what they did to any kind of documents? Or is it supposed to link to the initial provision that's really confining this to documents? But the bottom line was that the court said, wait, it's got to really relate back to the documents.
So for Fisher in particular, what were the specifics of his case and what does this mean for him? And are there other January 6th defendants who will be affected by the ruling as well?
Here I'm just reading from the opinion. It says, according to the plaintiff, about an hour after House recess, Fisher trespassed into the Capitol and was involved in a physical confrontation with law enforcement. It says a grand jury returned a 7-count indictment against Fisher. 6 of those counts alleged that Fisher forcibly assaulted a federal officer, entered and remained in a restricted building, and engaged in disorderly and disruptive conduct. Count 3 was the only count before the court, and that was the one charging him with violating 18 U.S.C. Section 1512. So this decision only applies to this count in the complaint. And so what the Supreme Court does is it decides issues, not cases. And so if the issue in front of it is, what's the meaning or reach of this particular statute, then what it'll do is it gives its read of the issue and then returns it back to the lower courts for further proceedings. So it's not like this person's prosecution all falls apart. As we were saying earlier, there were multiple counts, some related to physical assault This was one related to obstruction of an official proceeding. And this one is almost certainly not going to end up applying to him and to perhaps a number of other January 6th defendants.
Does this tell us anything about the nature of the prosecutions, the nature of the way it's been perceived? I mean, you definitely are hearing in some circles of the right, like this is a vindication. These people were overcharged. What do you make of all that?
As is often the case with these things come up, you're going to have partisan sides who sort of take the broadest possible reading here. So a lot of hand-wringing sort of on the left. What does this mean? Some exaltation and vindication on the right. And really, it's not really either one of these things. These protesters were charged with a big variety of criminal acts. Now, what this does do is for some protesters, this was the most significant thing they were charged with. For others, it's not. And so for some protesters, this is really, really good news because maybe their other charges are only related to the simple trespass into the building. But for those who actually attack police officers, for example, you've got a lot to worry about if you attack a federal officer, whether or not you have also obstructed an official proceeding. So it really does depend on what were the individual facts. But if you entered the Capitol on that day, if you forcibly entered it, you committed a crime. This is much more about what other crimes did you commit in addition to that, at least minimal one. And that just varies from defendant to defendant. But yeah, there are a number of defendants this applies to. It is by no means like a get out of jail free card for January 6th defendants writ large.
So another decision is one that cut down a landmark 1984 decision. The case was called Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council. People commonly just refer to this as Chevron. Can you tell us a little bit about this case and how it might actually affect the world and governance as we know it?
What Chevron said was that, we have these giant administrative agencies, EPA, SEC, you can go through the alphabet soup, HHS, down the list. And they have a lot of power to write regulations, and these regulations can have the force of law. And so the question is, when can courts invalidate or strike down these regulations? How much discretion do they have to write these laws? And with Chevron, there was kind of a two-step process. One is if the congressional statute that created the agency and gives it its power is very clear and the agency clearly contradicts that, then the court will intervene. But if it's more ambiguous, the rule was that the courts would just defer to the agency. Now, on the one hand, that might make a lot of pragmatic sense. In other words, well, aren't these agencies the home of an awful lot of expertise? How much expertise does the court have in, say, the environment or securities regulation? Shouldn't the court defer? Back in the 80s, when Chevron was decided, there was a lot of consensus, even in the conservative legal world, that, look, we don't want the courts involved in all these agency determinations. Are you kidding me? We would be swamped. And so for years and years and years and years, courts used this Chevron deference. That's what it was called, Chevron deference, to sort of say, unless an agency just went wild, yeah, we're going to kind of leave you alone. Now, note when I was saying that this was decided in the 80s, and why would conservatives be more okay with presidential power in the 80s? Well, that was arguably the apex of Republican presidential power from 80 to 92. But then a couple of things happened. Democrats started winning the White House again, and these agencies got bigger and bigger and bigger and more powerful. And it began to create a real issue where agencies were promulgating rules that they were then looking backwards at and ratifying with their own sort of deference and their own sort of autonomy. But wait a minute, the branch of government that pays attention to the interpretation of statutes is the judiciary, not the executive. So you began to have a lot of structural issues of, is this letting the executive just get out of control powerful? And as I told some of my more progressive friends recently, I said, have you read Project 2025, for example, the Trump blueprint? Does all of that presidential power alarm you? Well, then you should be pleased that the president's power is getting pared back in the Chevron decision, because it is now giving not just Joe Biden and the Biden administration less discretion to interpret and apply statutes. It also would be giving Trump and the Trump administration less discretion. What a lot of court rulings are doing all at once is they're saying this: the president is too powerful. The president has been making law. The president has been interpreting law. That's not the core function of the executive. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start to put the executive back in his box. So this is just another element of that. Obamacare is a perfect example. I think when I have trouble explaining, when I can see people are kind of like, what are you talking about here with regulatory lawmaking? I say, do you remember Obamacare contraception mandate that was so controversial in his term? That wasn't in the actual Obamacare law. When Obamacare was passed through the House and Senate, signed by the president, it did not specify this particular contraception mandate. What happened is the Obamacare law provided that HHS should specify what are sort of the necessary medications for reproductive health, et cetera. And then HHS created this mandate. And so this was a creation of the Obama executive agencies, not of the actual Congress. That's a concrete example. So then a new president comes in and they just remove that mandate. They have a new executive agency and the executive agency changes the law again, and they just remove that mandate. And so what happens is the law gets less stable. So when the Congress passes a law, for that law to change, Congress has to pass another law. But when you have a big amount of regulatory discretion, Congress can pass a law and then a president can come in and interpret it one way, and then a new election happens and they can interpret it in the opposite way. And both of them could be legal and valid, but that is now much less possible. So Congress is going to have to step up, do its job, and when it's going to create agency discretion, it needs to define it very specifically. And so I think this is overall quite good for our structure of government and quite good for Congress, and yet another wake-up call for the other branches of government to step forward. This was more the court stepping forward saying, hey, we're taking our job back. But if the court is taking its job back, that means Congress has to do its job that much better.
Russell, I want to ask you, does that give you any hope that in the light of a change like this, Congress will be able to start doing its job? The American people will start choosing people for Congress that are coming to do the job rather than coming to get Fox News and MSNBC hits and build their social media followings?
No, because I don't think the problem was that members of Congress were saying, we really don't have to do our job because the regulatory apparatus is already there. There are other factors that are at work all across culture. So it's one thing to say Congress has to do its job according to the courts. It's another thing to have a Congress that will. And we don't see any evidence of that right now. And as a matter of fact, I see that only getting worse in the short term because of the types of people that we see leaving. And these were often the people who actually were the most in the weeds when it came to actually writing legislation and carrying it out.
Well, let's turn away from current Supreme Court decisions to likely future Supreme Court issues. Last Wednesday, legislation was signed into law in Louisiana requiring the Ten Commandments displayed in school classrooms. Around the same time, lawmakers in Oklahoma announced their intent to incorporate the Bible into all K-12 curriculum. David, you've been an advocate for religious liberty. You've fought for it in the courts before. What do you make of these efforts? Do they have any chance of holding up to legal challenges that are already mounting against them?
Well, interestingly, they have a greater hope than in the recent past, but still I'm saying not that much hope at all, because let's look at Establishment Clause jurisprudence through, to use advisory opinions terminology, 3 buckets. Bucket 1 is religious exclusion. In other words, to sort of say, hey, we're going to look at an old courthouse and see that it has a display of the 10 Commandments along with Hammurabi's Code, et cetera. And Hammurabi can stay up and the 10 Commandments has to go down. Or there's an old war memorial that has a cross up in the war memorial. That cross has to come down. This is sort of disestablishmentarianism. In other words, we're going to just start tearing stuff away. Supreme Court has really put the brakes on that and has said in various forms, a kind of artificial ripping out of the public square of any kind of religious symbolism, religious speech, no. Religious exclusion, no. At the same time, there's the opposite no, which is religious establishment, no. And so in other words, so if you're going to say, let's take in Oklahoma, there was a charter school established that was a Catholic school. Now, a charter school is a public school. Oklahoma law had declared charter schools public schools, and then it created a public Catholic school, which would literally mean this is not just a publicly funded Catholic school, which Catholic schools, evangelical schools, they can all participate in voucher programs on an equal basis to secular schools. This would have been a Catholic public school where you would actually have members of the Catholic Church as members of the Catholic Church exercising state authority. That's on the other side of this. That's establishment, okay? And that is clearly unconstitutional. Now, what's in the middle? Acknowledgement. Classic religious acknowledgement sort of says, hey, wait, this is a religious society. Millions and millions and millions of us come from religious traditions that inform our worldview, inform our morality, inform our political philosophy, that we solemnize occasions with prayer routinely. So acknowledgement would be things like, hey, we're not going to tear down that old cross at a war memorial simply because somebody's offended by it, or a legislative prayer. If you're going to have an ecumenical practice of legislative prayer where religious leaders who come from the community begin a legislative session with prayer, that's classic acknowledgement. This is a nation full of religious people. And we're not going to establish any one religion, but we're going to permit our communities to acknowledge the religious character of the community, acknowledge the religious beliefs of its citizens. And that's generally in modern jurisprudence been just fine. So then the question is, the Oklahoma situation and the Louisiana situation, where do they fit? Is this just acknowledgement or is this establishment? And if you look at all of the commentary and all of the evidence of why these laws were enacted and why they're doing what they're doing, it's much more on the establishment than the acknowledgement side of the ledger.
Russell, when you see this battle, does it feel like the rehash of battles that Christians have been battling over public schools, prayer in public schools, things you and I both remember from our teen and elementary school years?
Well, I think it's a combination of a heightened biblical illiteracy on the part of the advocates for putting these things up, combined with this kind of extrinsic religion that we have being promoted continually right now, which has much less to do with religion itself than with tribal signaling. We're the kind of people who win in getting these symbols put up. When I say biblical illiteracy, what I mean is you have the argument, well, if you have the 10 Commandments on the wall, then that's going to prevent people from doing bad and immoral things. The text of Exodus itself says that is not the case. The 10 Commandments are handed down at Sinai. What do you immediately have happening? The golden calf. The entire point then of Paul looking back on the Old Testament is to say the law on its own has no power without the Spirit, without the transformation of the heart. And so the argument that somehow the 10 Commandments on its own can be transformative, even on Christian religious terms, doesn't work. It really isn't a serious effort to try to evangelize people, and it's also not a serious effort to actually try to hem in immorality and wrongdoing. It's just another one of the signaling conflicts that we have right now.
Do the 10 Commandments hanging in the walls do anything? Like, there's sort of this sense, and I know you guys have heard it, where someone will say, none of this happened when we had prayer in schools. And in fact, if we're thinking about like what was the world like when prayer in schools was at its maximum and Bible reading in schools was at its maximum, well, it was also with a lot of Jim Crow. So this idea that instituting these state-run religious practices provide us with an extra sort of moral boost has been rebuked. I wrote about this a couple of years ago when I was still at the Dispatch about one of the women who helped reintegrate Little Rock High School back in the 1960s and talking about how her classmates were hissing the N-word at her, that she had to walk through Arkansas National Guardsmen to be safe. No one would ever speak to her. She didn't feel like she could ever speak. And the only time they ever heard her voice when it was her turn to do the mandatory Bible reading. It's a version of almost like Christian superstition in many ways, that you put this up and the paper will have some sort of radiating talismanic effect on morality. And it just does not.
We will take a break here and we will reconvene a little later today when this ruling comes down. So we will be right back. We are back. David French joins us again. We have the decision now from the Supreme Court in the Trump immunity case. David, what are we looking at here?
We're looking at a mess. We always knew there was going to be some form of immunity for presidents, and the extent to which Congress couldn't criminalize, for example, the core functions of the presidency. So, for example, if the Constitution gives the president a pardon power, Congress couldn't say, well, if you exercise your pardon power, you're going to go to jail. But beyond that, things were really up in the air because the Constitution, other than articulating the president's powers, doesn't give the president immunity. There's no immunity within the text of the Constitution. And so what we're going to be dealing with here was sort of a judge-made doctrine that says, okay, if we're going to grant him immunity, how far are we going to go? And what the Supreme Court said was, we're going to go really far. So essentially the holding, again, this is, got to read it and reread it, but the first blink reaction is, if you can trace the president's use of power to sort of his core function, he's going to be completely immune, and you can't get into his motives. You can't talk about why he did it. You can't engage in a criminal inquiry. And so as I read this, it means in essence that an awful lot of generally applicable statutes, if they're applied into, let me just go where the dissent goes. Maybe he could order SEAL Team 6 to take out a rival because a direct order from the president to troops under his command is core constitutional function. You can't inquire into motives, etc. And then there's this other element that is, okay, there are official acts that are not at the core, they're more at the outer boundary. And those are going to be rebuttably immune. In other words, presumptively immune, but not absolutely immune. So there's going to be an individualized inquiry as to, was this truly within sort of this outer boundary of his presidential powers? And then the practical result is this case gets sent back to the lower court to sort all this out. So if you had any thought in your mind that this case was going to trial before the election, just remove that from your mind. The bigger question to me seems to be, wait a minute, what did the Supreme Court just do to the powers of the presidency? How much discretion did it give the president if the president is in the core realm of his authority? It seems to be that if the president could say to an attorney general, do X, and if X is unlawful and the attorney general doesn't do it, he can fire the attorney general, bring in a new attorney general, do X. And this is one of the reasons why the dissent in the case is really very upset.
Tell me, David, if I'm wrong. Gerald Ford wouldn't need to pardon Richard Nixon under this reading of the Constitution, right? Because a president commanding the CIA is within core duties. I mean, would there be any reason for Richard Nixon to go to trial?
Some of it would be clearly knocked out by this opinion, and then some of it would go back to this sort of presumptive immunity inquiry. And here's Sotomayor dissenting. The president of the United States is the most powerful person in the country and possibly the world. When he uses his official powers in any way under the majority's reasoning, he now will be insulated from criminal prosecution. Orders the Navy's SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a rival, immune. Organizes a military coup to hold on to power, immune. Takes a bribe in exchange for a pardon, immune, 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 immune. And she did not say, I respectfully dissent. She wrote, with fear for our democracy, I dissent. And part of me would say, is that hyperbole? Is that overblown? But we just had a president orchestrate an attack on our democracy and is now going to be immune for many of the key acts that furthered that actual attack. And so there are two decisions in this term, both involving Trump. First, the Colorado Trump disqualification decision, where the court went way beyond the necessary bounds to decide the case and basically gutted Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, holding that Congress has to pass enabling legislation, which really does contradict the text of the amendment and the way the amendment has been historically interpreted. But you saw the court's very pragmatic streak come out. Like, this is a Pandora's box. We can see how this is all going to be abused. And here you have it again. You have that very pragmatic streak coming out where they're saying, well, if presidents are vulnerable to prosecution, then they're going to be prosecuted, which they haven't been. It's not as if the court had to put the lid on this sort of long-standing banana republic practice of prosecuting every president when they leave off. It's happened one time in connection with the actual storming of the Capitol. And this sort of idea, this kind of pragmatic approach that the court has taken that says, because this has happened the first time, we've got to stop it from happening all the time, strikes me as just a conceptual flaw and also kind of a degree of pragmatism that contradicts originalism.
There's one part of the decision that actually Justice Barrett dissents from the majority. So she's with the majority, but then she dissents from one narrow aspect of it, which says that, to be specific, any conversations the president might have with his attorney general would be an official act. He's immune from prosecution for any of those conversations. Not only that, those conversations, any evidence about unofficial acts that would come from those privileged conversations between him and the attorney general cannot be entered into evidence against him for prosecution for other things. So this also potentially guts some of Jack Smith's case in terms of the evidence that he can bring into the court to prosecute Donald Trump for some of these crimes. Is that correct? Is that accurate?
Probably so. There's a lot that's not answered here. So what the court essentially did was say, okay, for this case, we're going to talk about, say, for example, the potential efforts to dismiss an attorney general or whatever. That's going to be core. Another element of this case, we're going to send back for further evaluation, but under terms that are very difficult for the government to overcome. It's presumptive immunity. And then there's another category that are just private acts entirely that are not touched by this opinion. So there can still be prosecution for the strictly private acts. Again, I keep going back to this 14th Amendment case because they both have echoes. And the echoes they have is it's very obvious that the court majority in both of these cases was wrestling with the pragmatic results of their decision. And the pragmatic results of their decision were very key. Now, I don't think anyone would dispute again when I said, hey, if Congress said, if the president of the United States exercises commander-in-chief authority, he can be prosecuted. Well, that would clearly contradict Article 2 of the Constitution. He has commander-in-chief authority. But if Congress said, through the Uniform Code of Military Justice, here are the laws of war, and any person in the chain of command who violates the laws of war can be prosecuted, that is to say, in essence, that, yeah, the commander-in-chief is subject to the same war crime statutes as anybody else, is not stripping from him commander-in-chief power. So what we're doing is we're creating an environment where in these core exercises of power with immense consequence on people's lives, there's this absolute immunity. And that to me is dangerous. In my view, it's a very bad and dangerous ruling, which places too much of American law and American justice into the personal honor of the president.
Well, and that's especially true when it is impossible right now to remove a president from office.
It brings you back to what are the two sort of original sins that bring us to this point. One is Donald Trump getting the nomination in spite of his clear lack of qualifications and character in 2016. And then, particularly in January of 2021, the refusal of the Republican Congress to impeach and remove after January 6th. It's like you have this one constitutional mechanism that's really in place to restrain somebody of his character, and they refuse to do the job. And so now we continue to deal with these downstream consequences of it, where others in law enforcement are sort of trying to bring some measure of accountability. And you have this glaring issue that has just been made so much worse by this ruling.
Well, you know, what you see time and time again is institutions unwilling to do the hard thing. And no question that impeaching and removing a president, something that's never happened in the history of our country, is a hard thing. I think it would have happened in 1974 with Nixon, but it was cut off by Nixon going ahead and resigning. Impeaching and removing a president is a momentous thing. Disqualifying a president from the ballot is a momentous thing. All of these things are momentous things. But the reality is all of those things are actually mandated by the Constitution. The language is mandatory. And the court just essentially erased the mandatory elements of that language. In this one, what they did was they filled in the Constitution. You know, whatever version of originalism that you hold to, begins with text in all caps. So even if you're sort of a text history and tradition person in the way the Bruin case and Thomas, it should be text history and tradition. If you're support more like a tiers of scrutiny type analysis of Constitution, text really is where things are centered. There's just no text regarding this core immunity argument. So it's all implications from text. And the idea that granting executive authority in the president means executive authority can include otherwise criminal actions, so long as they are in that executive authority, that is dangerous.
Well, it's maybe a good day in honor of the coming 4th of July and everything else that's happening in the news. A good day to go read George Washington's farewell address.
The dangers of faction, yes.
And back when people believed in actually saying farewell.
Exactly. And if you don't have time for that, just turn on One Last Time from Hamilton, which is basically the gist of that speech, the importance of going home. And we pray for the months and the weeks ahead, which feel more and more unstable and uncertain, but we pray with faith. We are not a people without hope. So, David, thank you for joining us once again.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And Biden and Trump are the nominees, but God is on the throne. And we should take absolute confidence that we are not dependent on either one of these two men. They're important in our lives for only a brief season. And so thank God for that.
Shane, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Let's begin at the beginning. Could you take us back to October 7th, 2023, to the moment that you heard about the attacks in Israel? And could you recall for us your response?
Absolutely heartbroken, head spinning, outraged, grieving, for those. Still unfolding, who's responsible, what's happening. But even the survivors, how it's going to impact their lives. And even more recently, as I was in the Tel Aviv airport, just looking at the faces of every one of the folks still being held hostage and brokenhearted about it. And we didn't even know, the numbers were still coming out, I guess, is how many lives were lost. But to think of what it felt like to be there, and obviously to think this is probably a targeted attack. There's probably some other motivations fueling the kind of hatred and violence of October 7th. So broke my heart. I can only imagine it broke the heart of God. I immediately thought of the people that I know there. I've been over to the West Bank and in that region, both in Israel and the Palestinian territories for many, many years, many, many times. And so I'm thinking of all the folks that may have lost their loved ones, both in the attacks on October 7th, but then as it began to unfold, those lives that I know in Gaza, the ministries there, the churches there, especially most of my interactions have been with Christian Palestinians. So all the folks in the West Bank, how this could escalate already volatile and violent situations in the West Bank. So I immediately, started reaching out to people I know and love there and, feeling a lot of the same emotions I had: outrage at the attack, grief over uncertainty about what's next, and so, and then I just became a good listener, trying to listen to what I could do to help.
My reaction was very much the same. I kept thinking of particularly friends in Israel whose kids are in the IDF or were of the age. When I was seeing the music festival, I was thinking of friends whose kids are of the age that might be serving in the IDF or might be at the music festival. I've been in contact, been connected with, not as deeply as Shane, but I've visited Bethlehem and Bethlehem Bible College a number of times over the years and thought of that community. I remember going over there a few years ago, a couple of days after riots. We got off of buses out in front of Bethlehem Bible College, and the streets were just littered with shell casings from salt bullets and rubber bullets and gas canisters. And just thinking about this fear of, here we go again. What is violence going to do to our Christian brothers and sisters there? What's happening to my friends? What's happening to their kids? What's happening to my American Jewish friends who have relatives in Israel? And I sat in front of my computer screen the entire day, just paralyzed. I just couldn't stop watching news, social media, looking for updates, texting friends, thinking, my goodness, what are we watching here?
Self-defense has been a cry from both sides throughout this war. We've heard from Hamas and from Palestine that their attack is a response to aggressions from Israel. Israel is claiming self-defense in their ongoing conflict. Shane, do you believe that Hamas responded in self-defense on October 7th?
One of the things that's important about this particular situation is that there were lots of things happening before October 7th. And some of that is targeted violence to Palestinian people through the forms of policies and actual aggression from the Israeli Defense Force and other settler colonialism, taking over of homes and land. So there's a backdrop of over 70 years of oppressive policies that have created this sort of anger and pain. Also, anti-Semitism is ancient. There's hundreds of years of anti-Semitism. Of course, we often think of the Holocaust, but there's so many centuries before that that sort of paved the way to that one of the darkest points in human history and the reality of what human beings are really capable of in destroying and desecrating lives made in the image of God. So there's both of those things happening. And I think that's where you see this kind of combustible collision of pain and fear and anger. So I, as a Christian, don't believe that you can reconcile violence with faithfulness to Jesus. I just don't see a way that we can love our enemies and simultaneously prepare to kill them. I really believe that there's a part of this that is also, as Romans says, that we're not to conform to the patterns of this world, but to be transformed, to have a new imagination in Christ. So that's where my faith calls me to be a peacemaker. As Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God. And it also transcends the two-sidedness of this, right? I can grieve the lives lost on October 7th and be outraged about that violence. I can also be grieved equally by every single Palestinian life that's been lost. So I think our grief is proportionate to the pain. It's also like indiscriminate, that a life on either side of that wall of hostility and apartheid is equally precious and made in the image of God, and it grieves God's heart. So, this is the backdrop of 1,200 lives lost that we should be outraged about. And now, how outraged are we at the over 35,000 lives? And how many, Palestinian children have to die to atone for the sins of Hamas on October 7th? That's a question I think, many of us are asking.
Is it accurate to conflate Hamas with Palestinians, Gazans? Like, how do you separate these two when culturally, politically, it seems civilians are so enmeshed with a political system that actually seeks to do them harm?
For me, this is one of the reasons that the Palestinian Christian voices have so much credibility and integrity, and they're so vitally important right now. The folks that are there have a lot of wisdom to help us move forward. They've seen the complicity of the U.S. government and Israel in kind of paving the way for some of the violence that we see at Hamas. They're also very critical of violence. Palestinian Christians have drafted a powerful, Jesus-centered, deeply spiritual letter to the church that we posted on our Red Letter Christians website. So the hundreds of years old roots that informs their current perspective is just so important right now. And I've never heard any Palestinian Christian defend October 7th of the violence of Hamas. They're also unbelievably grieved right now by what's happening. And it's affecting church members that are hiding out in the Christian churches there, that are some of the oldest churches in Christianity that have been bombed or impacted by the bombing in Gaza. So this has a very personal side for them. And you start to ask, how are we going to build a more peaceful world? And what they've taught me is that we're not going to build a more peaceful world by killing each other's children. And we literally see a world that is living by the sword and dying by the sword, as Jesus said. And it is there is a better way, and I believe that's the way of Jesus, and it's a way that refuses to mirror the evil, that refuses to mirror that violence, and that's what Jesus teaches me, even up to the point of his last breath on the cross, where he dies with mercy on his lips, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." And I don't think it's a naive gospel that Jesus is out of touch with the real world or the evils of Hamas. I mean, he died on the cross. So I think he's showing us a way to live in an evil world without becoming poisoned by that evil ourselves.
In the Christian tradition, along with a sort of radical commitment to nonviolence, which I think Shane has represented well here, there has been a long tradition as well of understanding a significant distinction in the New Testament between the words of Jesus as a call to the Christian in their life and their relationships, and the role of the state. Paul describes the role of the state to bear the sword, cause of justice, and how does that work out? To fully unpack either perspective on that is more than we have time for on this podcast. But I mention it just simply to say that I definitely am speaking from a very different tradition inside the Christian tradition with regard to this. One of the things Shane said that I'd love to respond to is he said, how many Palestinian children have to die to atone for the deaths of October the 7th? I understand why he's asking that question, but it misunderstands the moral culpability for those deaths. It misunderstands the roots of Israel's violence in this war. People who are marching and chanting and calling for a ceasefire now forget that there was a ceasefire on October the 6th. They forget that for the better part of 15 years, with the exception of a couple of skirmishes, Israel had withdrawn from Gaza, and Israel had functionally had a ceasefire with Gaza, with the exception of the fact that they had Iron Dome and David's Sling, which they were using to shoot tens of thousands of rockets that were being fired at them from Gaza over that period of time. And so when we talk about the deaths of Palestinians, even when we get to the death counts, one of the things that we've seen is who has died and how many have died, how have they died. The UN's count on that has drastically lowered since May because of lack of verification. We don't know what the count is. Regardless, every word that Shane said, I agree with in terms of grieving the loss of that life, that it is a tragedy. But it's the moral responsibility of Hamas. And it's the moral responsibility of Hamas, who is the governing authority in Gaza, that starts this war. And then in the aftermath, what we saw, there was a very important piece that was published in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of weeks ago about the head of Hamas in Gaza and about leaked communications that have been captured, where he was essentially celebrating the size of the death count in Gaza because it is part of Hamas's strategy to make Palestinian innocent people vulnerable in this war, to get that death count as high as possible in order to make Israel the villain before the eyes of the world. You want a ceasefire, you want the war to end, give back the hostages, and Israel will go home the same day. But the deaths of the Palestinian civilians are part of Hamas's strategy in this. That's why Hamas has attacked the pier for aid. That's why Hamas tries to shoot planes out of the sky that are dropping aid. That's why Hamas attacks the checkpoints. They attacked Kerem Shalom. They're trying to limit the amount of aid that comes into the region because, as the UN released a report, there's no famine in Gaza right now. In fact, there's tens of thousands of trucks of aid sitting inside the Gaza border waiting for UNRWA to distribute it because they've flooded it so significantly with aid. Where we significantly differ is, I would say, that there is fundamentally in this conflict at this moment, and again, the larger history is a complicated conversation, but because you have a terrorist organization whose primary strategy includes elevating the death count of their own citizens as high as possible to make the other side look like the villain, I think we have to calculate that moral culpability differently. It's not that Israel is going out to kill women and children to make Hamas pay the price for their sins. It's that Hamas is hiding under schools and hospitals and deliberately keeping civilians in harm's way.
There's a few things I find problematic. To begin with, the theology of peacemaking or nonviolence, right? There are other traditions of Christianity that allow for violence as a response in self-defense, or Augustine's just war theory, but those are a few hundred years old after Christ. And I think what I would say is that you don't see any Christian for the first 300 years making room for justified killing or violence, not a single one. And they didn't allow a blank check for the state They didn't differentiate between a king or a governor, a prime minister, or a politician. It is still wrong to kill. And I think of the Bishop Cyprian, his words in essence were, it's strange that when a criminal kills another person, we all call it evil, as we should. But when the state does it, we sanctify it and we call it good, or we call it just. And Cyprian, the bishop, says it's wrong to kill, period. No matter whether it's a soldier or a governor or a criminal on the streets. And I think that was the conviction of the early church, is that it's wrong to kill. And that's why they stood so passionately against violence in every form. And they're so consistent in that. They spoke against abortion. They spoke against the death penalty. They spoke against militarism and war. They were incredibly consistent. They even spoke against the gladiatorial games, which they saw as a glorification of violence in their cultural context. So I have no doubt that Christians should be a consistent force for life. Having said that, I think even Augustine would be appalled at the response of Israel to October 7th, because one of the frameworks for just war theory is that there's a proportionality, that there's some boundaries for the response to violence. And some of that goes way back to one of the oldest frameworks of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That ancient law was called lex talionis, which is where we get the idea of retaliation. And it actually gave permission to do reciprocal harm. You could hurt them back just like they hurt you, but exactly like it. So in the case of 1,200 lives, you could kill 1,200 people, but not a single one more. I think that's one framework. But I would say as Christians, this is where Jesus becomes a nagging problem to the idea of violence and war. Is he said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Moses told you this, but I tell you this. And I would suggest Jesus is going to say, even though we may have a case to be made, even legally, for responding to violence with violence, don't do it. You can do better than that. I even think of my mom saying, 2 wrongs don't make a right. And this is exactly the kind of case that we have where the cure is worse than the disease. What we see happening from Israel is not only mirroring, but it's exponentially creating more suffering, more pain, more trauma that is fueling the fires of hatred. So that scripture where Jesus wept over Jerusalem because they didn't know the things that would lead to peace. That's exactly what we see in real time. Jesus saying, live by the sword, you die by the sword. We're seeing it happen in real time. I think of the way forward in all of this. It's so important that Hamas not become the moral compass. Hamas is not my moral compass. I'm not trying to defend them. I don't know anyone defending Hamas, but I know a lot of people that are twisting scripture and theology in order to defend atrocities by the state of Israel that are very unchristlike, that are indefensible evils that are happening by the state of Israel. And I think that is also dangerous, to use the Bible as a weapon to justify those atrocities. So Jesus is my moral compass. If they give us hell, we give them heaven. No matter how much they hate us, we refuse to hate them. So I think there's a lot of ways that Jesus can inform us on a better way forward than we see right now, but not sanctifying the violence, not funding and fueling the violence of Israel as state revenge. That's what it is. Mike, I think another conversation could be had on, could we really get the hostages freed? And I believe that we could. I believe that we're getting further from that, not closer to it.
One of the reasons why you don't see the early church reckoning with state violence in the way that you describe, the church didn't have to reckon with state violence theologically in that manner because they weren't in power. You see the church begin to reckon with those theological questions as the church becomes more dominant, and now they start having to deal with political questions in a way that they hadn't before. What they do inherit, and here's another place where I think I would see more consistency in terms of how the one informs the other, and I think the early church would have seen this as well, is more of a clear through line theologically from the Old Testament to the New. And in the Old Testament, the laws governing the state, was very clear that the rulers of Israel had a monopoly on violence within the state, and at times had a mandate to go to war. I'm not a quote-unquote Christian Zionist in the sense that I think that there is a biblical mandate for the Jewish people to go to war for the land. I don't hold that belief. My argument for the existence of the state of Israel is about the status of the Jewish diaspora, the weirdness of the politics of the early 20th century, their status as refugees, both in Europe and from the middle, the 700,000 that came from Middle Eastern countries. It's a political and human rights argument for me for the existence of the state of Israel. So just to be clear.
It's an interesting conversation. I'd love to have another time, because I'd love to hear how you feel about the expansion of the settlements too, the continual taking of Palestinian homes. And I mean, if you've been over there, that's one of the things that's so heart-wrenching, right?
I think that it has been a tragic mistake in the last 20 years. The expansion of the settlements during and after the Second Intifada, what we've seen over the last 2 decades in particular, is that's all sort of gotten more permission. I think that's a tragic mistake.
But it does get all conflated in a version of Zionism, right? That God gave this land. It doesn't matter if it's your house. God gave it to me. If you got a problem with it, it's your problems with God. Like, it's hard to differentiate between a softer Zionism and that Zionism, especially when we see the things that are being done under the theology of Zionism right now.
Again, I don't make a theological argument for any of it. So regarding just war, again, that first 300 years, I think, reflects the particular concerns of Christians. We tend to theologize what's front of mind and what we're reckoning with. And that's the historical theological argument for how these arguments emerge when they emerge. Just like arguments about slavery and abolition get much, much sharper in America in the 19th century as that issue becomes much more of a front of mind issue for Christians. Or in the 20th century, issues of the equal value and worth of men and women in the church and the roles of men and women in the church sharpens under different circumstances. The other issue I want to make sure I address, though, is you talked about proportionality. And in the just war tradition and in the laws of war, if you look at contemporary law of war stuff, the way proportionality is defined is not eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Proportionality is the state has the right to respond only with necessary force to meet whatever the threat is. Hamas has been in charge of Gaza for 15 years. They have had billions of dollars flooded into that country via the UN, via Qatar, via the Iranians, via Israel, via Israeli aid as well. And every dollar of that aid did not go into bettering the lives and bettering the economic opportunities for the Palestinian people. It went into what they're estimating are between 350 and 500 miles of tunnels underneath Gaza that have made that place a fortress for terror, which, in order to take out that infrastructure, demands a very, very different kind of response. To eliminate that threat has required a forceful response that, it looks disproportional from a certain lens. But the proportional response is that Israel, the state, has a responsibility to make its people secure. That's the primary issue driving the extent of the force. Are there atrocities? Are there war crimes happening? Are there things that are happening? I am always hesitant to say yes or no to either of those questions right now, because in the fog of war, lots happens. Lots has happened in this war where there's an explosion at a hospital and it's called an Israeli airstrike and we're told there's 500 people dead. A couple of days later, it's clarified it was an errant Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket and somewhere between 13 and 30 are dead. What we have seen during this war is when a war crime happens from the Israelis and it's documented, those authorities are removed from their posts. Some of them are brought up on charges. We've seen numerous cases of that since the outbreak of the war. When Hamas commits a war crime, they post it on Telegram and it's celebrated. There's a standard at work and there's a lens through which I hear you interpreting the actions of Israel in a way that I don't hear you applying the same standard to Hamas. I don't hear the rage at Hamas for having a calculated tactic that leads to the deaths of their, thousands and thousands of their people. And them literally saying, Sinwar literally saying to his people, this is exactly what we wanted. This is exactly how we wanted it to play out. This is exactly how we drew it up.
I think we should be outraged at death. I think God is outraged when any life is cut short, Mike. And I have tried to do that from the very beginning of October 7th, to grieve those lives lost, to be outraged at the Holocaust and the targeted anti-Semitism that's targeted hatred, whether it's the Tree of Life Synagogue here in Pennsylvania or the Holocaust, and the way that Christianity is sort of contributed to anti-Semitism throughout history. So I've written a lot about that. I think it's one of the earliest sins of Christianity is anti-Jewishness. What I also feel, though, as I've said, I don't know many people that are waving a Hamas flag. And if they are, that's messed up. I know a lot of people that are waving an Israeli flag that are using Christian theology to try to defend things that are so unloving, so unchristlike. And that's one of my concerns, that what's at stake right now are human lives, but what's also at stake is the credibility of the gospel of Jesus. I care about people knowing the love of Jesus. And when we have Christians that seem to be more shaped by a misinterpretation of the Old Testament and Hebrew scriptures and Zionism that reduces Jesus. Jesus is the full manifestation of God's love, as scripture says. And as he embodies that love, there's no way that we can read the Sermon on the Mount, that we can look to the life of Jesus to inform how we live and defend the things that we see happening in Gaza, or the things that we see happening on October 7th or from Hamas. So I actually believe not only is it important to be faithful to Jesus, but he's actually showing us the narrow way that leads to life, that we're just going to keep dying if we continue conforming to the patterns and logic of violence. And so there is another way. I think Jesus becomes so central to that. I always keep recentering Jesus. Let's recalibrate like the GPS, come back to Jesus. And so if we are only grieved by the hostages and the lives lost on October 7th, there's a gap, a hole in our theology. And if we can't grieve the lives lost on October 7th, then there's something wrong. This is not a soccer game, where we're choosing between two teams. I think this is a human tragedy, but it's also a spiritual and theological crisis where people are twisting theology in order to justify things. And some of this is because of the backdrop of anti-Semitism. Some people believe to speak out against the state of Israel is to speak out against God, because God has this special moral immunity to the state of Israel, which is ironic because it's a secular state and it makes mistakes and it's making them every single day. So we should never sanctify any nation state, including America. And I think that's part of why this is so important, is because human lives are at stake, but also the gospel of Jesus is at stake.
I deeply appreciate the way you're framing it here. Even though I see it differently, some of the overarching issues, there's a lot I think we agree on. I appreciate your voice. I appreciate that challenge. I appreciate that confrontation to the church where there is a reflexive, sometimes instinct to sort of embrace violence or embrace these sort of ideological narratives. My challenge to you from watching this conflict over a number of months, from watching the protests, a perfect example of this is a letter you mentioned earlier, the letter from the Palestinian Christians that's posted at Red Letter Christians. That letter doesn't mention Hamas. That letter doesn't mention October the 7th. I just pulled it up to make sure I'm remembering it correctly, and I am. Reading the letter, you would think that out of nowhere, on October the 19th, Israel started a bombardment of Gaza for no reason whatsoever. There's a unique challenge for Palestinian Christians that doesn't get as talked about in the West as it needs to, which is that Palestinian Christians live under the thumb of an authoritarian government called Fatah. Fatah makes their lives miserable as well. They're not as bad as Hamas. Maybe Gaza would be in better hands if it were led by Fatah. If there were elections, it wouldn't happen. But nonetheless, the circumstances of the Palestinian Christians are unique because of a pressure and an oppression we don't talk about nearly as much as I think we ought to in these conversations. I agree with you, and I do genuinely grieve with you when the Bible is distorted to create these strange, Israel can do whatever they want because they're blessed by God. I don't think that's appropriate. I don't think that makes sense. And I think when Israel makes mistakes, they have to be addressed. They have to be held accountable. But I think there are aspects of this narrative that I would love to hear more from you on in the future.
One of the things that always breaks my heart is when I talk to folks and they say, I'm not talking to my dad anymore because we disagree on where this war in Israel is going. Or we used to have a great small group, but things have gotten really messy now because there are such deep divisions politically in my group. And both of you gentlemen are accustomed to having discourse that is charitable, that is winsome, that is impassioned. And I think of a statement that Stanley Hauerwas made alluding to Augustine's City of God. He said, the church is a social ethic. It doesn't so much have a plan or a policy to make war less horrible, but it's an alternative to the sacrifice of war in a war-weary world, that the church is the end of war. And I think about that not so much in a political realm, as we've been talking about, but in the virtues that we need to develop as American Christians to be able to have conversations like these, where we can sit across the table from people with whom we deeply disagree and engage in a way that is charitable, that moves the conversation forward, that deepens understanding. So on a really, really practical level, what have you learned from conversations like these? Practical help for listeners who say, I want to do better. I want to be able to talk to my dad about this. I want to be able to sit down with my small group and not have a conversation about the headlines, make everything get radio silent. What are some practical ways that we can engage with one another on these kind of hot button topics?
One of the things that I think the social media age breeds is a kind of cynicism about the motives of the person that you're in a conversation with. What you end up doing is saying, well, they're saying this because of this. They say this about, this is why they're MAGA, but the real reason they're MAGA is insert, sort of bad faith interpretation. I have tried, not perfectly, but I have tried as much as I can to kind of eliminate that from my thinking. To assume, until you really know for sure otherwise, to assume that someone is engaging you in good faith. And when they tell you, this is what I think and this is why I think it, to believe them and to take them at their word on that. Because that's an invitation to empathy. That's an invitation for you to put yourself in their shoes and say, how would I feel if I saw it the way they saw it? That's a key step to being able to have civil conversation across difference.
For those of us that choose Jesus, to stay centered on what that means for us. What does it look like to follow Jesus in a world where evil is such a real thing? To look at the Sermon on the Mount fresh, to look at the Beatitudes and say, how does that posture us in this conflict? Like if we believe Jesus is blessing those who mourn, who are we mourning with on October 7th? Who are we mourning with now? We're very good at talking about people that we don't know. And I think there's another side of this I would say is like, let's talk with other people, not just at them. And love should be our guiding light. Scripture says perfect love casteth out fear. And I think sometimes it's fear that compels some of the most horrific things that we can do to one another. And so the question is, what does love look like for us? What does love require of us? So thanks for the conversation, both of you. And thanks for people that listen to things they disagree with today. I think we're all better off if we sort of stretch each other a little bit right now.
Thank you so much, Shane. Thank you, Mike. Friends, listen to each other, read out of your comfort zone, and seek as best you can to walk in the way of Jesus. We will see you next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester. Theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.